Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining this session. There's my title there, and I am your speaker. And I'm really happy to be talking to everybody today and to get your feedback and just kind of think through this whole thing with you. So this is me in a nutshell. And what we're going to be talking about today is isolation of Black colleagues in primarily white workplaces. And I say we because, as I said, this is an exploration for me, and I'm in like 2 toes into it. So um, I'm hoping that your questions and comments will help me flesh things out and learn and explore further. The category I mentioned, primarily white workplaces, encompasses most publishing contexts, as publishing is a primarily white industry. And this extends to the corporate and nonprofit editing context also. So a little bit about isolation. In 2012 study focusing on about 40 women in different areas of the US, specifically those Black women who worked in primarily white workplaces, reported isolation as a stressor and code switching as a coping mechanism. Now, code switching, according to the Harvard Business Review, is, quote, involves adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in ways that will optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment, quality service, and employment opportunities, unquote. Today, I'm going to discuss some alternatives to having to do all that, mainly increased visibility and acceptance of non-standard Englishes and racial and ethnic differences among editor colleagues, and standards of professionalism that are rooted more in core skills and not in standards that default to whiteness. I'm going to use interviews from my website, outsidethebook.com, and a few research papers to explore these issues with you. So let's look at some of the data on the makeup of the publishing industry and the editing profession. Lee and Low Books, a multicultural children's publishing company, recently conducted its second diversity survey of publishing companies and other book business related entities that chose to participate. It found that the industry is over 3/4 white, 81% heterosexual, and 89% non-disabled. Editors who self-identified as white made up 85%. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics 2023 data, the industry is 91% white. So it stands to reason that most of these workplaces are primarily white workplaces. And now that we've set a stage for our context, let's look at some people who are working in it. I started this website in 2020 with the goal of bringing more visibility to editors of color, so people know we exist. But just like that 2012 study I mentioned just a little bit ago, this sample is pretty small. It's about 50 editors that I've interviewed. I asked questions about how they got their jobs, how they did their jobs, how they stayed in community with other editors, and other questions. And I asked editors whether they faced discrimination or had witnessed discrimination in organizations. And most would say they hadn't faced discrimination, but they would also say things like this: marginalization exists, I just make the most of my opportunities, it's good to have a place just for us, things like that. And I thought these responses were interesting. Much of 21st century discrimination is not overt, so I wasn't surprised that they hadn't experienced that kind of discrimination. But I picked up on a subtext. They felt uneasy, but it didn't feel to them like it was because of discrimination against them. And I appreciate that people, probably didn't want to share too much to, and maybe like thinking they may face further isolation in their workplaces or in the profession if they were, too honest about something they didn't think they should be, or maybe they didn't feel discriminated against because of ineffective assimilation. That is, maybe they had already changed themselves to fit in, and so they felt like everything was fine. Or maybe I didn't ask the right questions, or hadn't established enough rapport to really have those conversations. So most of the correspondence between me and these editors was just through email, and we didn't know each other before the interviews. So I wanted to get at what they really felt, in my opinion, or I should have just been nosy and everything was actually just fine. But I realized it wasn't fair to ask them to come forth with their experiences if I didn't come forth with mine. So late last year, I decided to start with my own experience and what I really wanted to explore. Much of my discomfort in primarily white workplaces is centered on language, speaking so called proper English and not being stereotyped as a so called inferior Black colleague. Um, and not fitting in culturally has also been a theme. I mean, at one office, there was a discussion about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and who was better. And I had no frame of reference for either band, but they still asked me to weigh in like I would know. Um, but the further I got into my career, the more comfortable I felt, and the more comfortable I got with code switching, for better or worse. I wondered why it had to be that way and why Black folk had to code switch at work and what it would be like to change those things. And when the article against copy editing was published last year, it argued that as it is currently practiced, editing is a white supremacist project. And it raised a lot of the questions that I had been thinking about. But I think I was the only editor in my circle who really, really loved the article. But this led me to investigating the place of non-standard Englishes in formal writing. And I also thought that many of my coworkers, past and present, may not know what my experience is like, editing text to standard English, but not speaking standard English at home, and how that experience tracks with those of many other Black professionals re-spoken English, regardless of the industry that they work in. So I wanted to convey that experience and explore the academic research, memoirs, essays, fiction, and other writings about it. Which brings me to some of the papers that I'm going to share with you. But be warned, this is not like a thorough and exhaustive investigation at all. These are just some of the things I'm starting to read and have got me thinking really hard about how we can stretch the profession and be more inclusive of non-standard Englishes. The first article I want to share with you discusses, how we put these things into practice. The article was written by an editor of a collection of essays and the copy editor who worked on the pieces. And all of the essay authors were non-native English-speaking writers. The copy editor and the anthology editor wanted to practice their progressive views about language variation in a context which they called high-stakes academic text. They noted as more academic writing across the world is done in English, there needs to be a way to account for different Englishes. And they cited research that pushed toward not seeing language variation as something to be fixed. But the copy editor wasn't sure he ended up practicing his progressive views, as he could justify some of his edits only by saying it was what his ear told him. And even though the authors thought that being more accepting of variations would have a great impact on pedagogy, writing, and publishing practice, they concluded that it wasn't possible within the demands of academic publishing where, quote, sentences, texts, or authors can be perceived as lacking in some way if there's a variation from standard English, unquote. Now, Professor Sean Young has a totally different outlook on the use of different Englishes in academic papers. Young published the article, Should Writers Use Their Own English, in 2010. Some of you may have heard of this one. He wrote the paper entirely in Black English and eloquently makes his point, arguing against the views of a New York Times columnist who thinks graduate students do not have a right to their own English. He categorizes the columnist's argument as dominant language ideology, which he says is the belief that there's one set of dominant language rules that stem from a single dominant discourse like standard English, and all writers and speakers must conform to it to communicate effectively. Dominant English ideology says you can have your own English, but leave it at home. And yes, Young does point out the contradiction of saying you're not entitled to your own English, but you can have your own English at home. He advocates learning many dialects, or at least being open to the use of them. And he says we already do this when we code mesh, and that people are more plurilingual than we want to realize. He exercises this code meshing in the paper itself. He's writing in Black English, but it's not as if he's trying to find like a Black word to explain the concepts that he's talking about. Take this example. Quote, code meshing blend dialects, international languages, local idioms, chat room lingo, in both formal and informal speech acts. This mode of communication be just as frequently used by politicians and professors as it be by journalists and advertisers, unquote. In his opinion, it's the teaching of English that has to change, bringing all of this into the classroom, along with punctuation rules, attention to meaning and word choice, sentence structure, and standard English. In addition to stressing how common code meshing is, and gives examples from journalistic, political, and academic arenas, he emphasizes the problem of perception and racism in acknowledging that different Englishes are okay. Young says, quote, standard English ideology insists that minority people will never become an Ivy League English department chair or president of Harvard University if they don't perfect a mastery of standard English. At the same time, the ideology instructs that white men will gain such positions even with a questionable handle of standard grammar and rhetoric, unquote. And then he goes on to quote that they can even become president of the country with such a lack of skills. And race and ethnicity, these themes are also picked up in a paper called A History of Professionalism by Rebecca Royfee. And while Royfee focuses on professionalism among lawyers, she knows some points about professionalism in general, like it has been used to resist change and hold on to outdated modes of practice. But she says that it isn't the horrible monster that researchers make it out to be. And by this time, she's writing in 2012. She says that professionalism allows, quote, outsiders to translate their individual experiences into a common language that can change and benefit the country as a whole, unquote. Okay, I do agree with her that more diverse professions can benefit the country as a whole, but I feel like there's some interesting word choice here. The use of outsiders in particular is revealing, even when Royfee is talking about indigenous communities. And the use of common language, well, what would that be? What is that? Is it a default to whiteness? I mean, that could be problematic. Her main point, too, that professionalism is a way to gain the respect of white people or whoever the holders of the common language are, sits on the same plate with that New York Times columnist dominant language ideology. Like there's only one way and you should try to fit in. Royfee sees her position as relatively positive. She notes that even white men have to, quote unquote, blanch out some of their personality to fold into the workplace. For Royfee, professionalism has the potential to bridge the tension, for minorities at least, between ethnic identity and public persona. She says, quote, ethnic identity is not authentic and public persona is not artificial. They are constantly defining one another, unquote. So, okay, some problematic text there, but also some interesting ideas there at the end. And I would add that this paper is in conversation with the article on editing non-native English-speaking authors that I mentioned earlier, because those authors were struggling with similar issues, and they asked these questions. Does the copy editing deprive those those authors of their voice? Or does it provide them with greater cultural and linguistic capital that allows them to navigate the institutional system of academic publishing? Or in Royfee's lingo, allow them to benefit from professionalism, right? But further on this tension about whether to drop the signifiers of your race or your culture when you're at work, after conducting interviews in 2002 with Black professionals in middle management and above in predominantly white workplaces, authors Ferguson and Doherty coined the phrase the paradox of the Black professional. Their literature review aligns with Royfee's, who I just mentioned, noting that early in our nation's history, certain white men used the term professionalism to separate themselves into a kind of aristocracy. The legacy of this is a default to whiteness in the definition of professionalism, as noted by these authors when they're looking at the literature around this. Their literature review also suggests the dehumanization of Black professionals. They note specifically that non-Black people recognize Black people's humanity as Black people become better at performing whiteness. And these performances of whiteness can include using the so-called white voice to appear more intelligent or less intimidating, as I'm doing right now, straightening Black hair, working twice as hard to avoid being stereotyped, or feeling as if they have to strip themselves of cultural attributes completely to be considered professional. Thus, the paradox of the Black professional. That is, Black people can perform whiteness and get closer to the so-called goal, but they'll always be in Black bodies, and therefore they'll always come up short. Now, so I'm hesitant to label the things that I'm talking about as solutions to the problem. There are researchers who've looked into this for a long time, and I'm just beginning to chew on the things that they put out there. So I'll talk about the thoughts that I've had in response to my experiences and what I'm reading. And I'm labeling these things imaginings, following one of my favorite authors, Tsitsi Dangaremga, who says, quote, decolonization is first and foremost a discursive event that must take place in the imagination before society can expect to engage in the process of decolonization, unquote. And I want to say too that, I mean, it's a quandary that I find myself in after, coming to these readings outside of work, right? And that can be after a full day of truly loving what I do, but also wanting the profession to stretch and expand the ways that we look at our work. And I'm sure every Black editor does not feel the way I do, for various reasons. Maybe cultural and wanting to hold on to that part of the culture, or they and some white colleagues may feel like I'm advocating a lower quality professionalism because they see Black English as inferior. I'm also in a privileged position to advocate for Black English, because I'm mid-career at this point. I feel like if I was, a grade school student arguing against a teacher, or, trying to make this point when I'm just starting my career, I may be less confident in it, or care more about performing whiteness than talking about this. But I think the more visibility and acceptance of non-standard Englishes can have imp better implications for editors. First, I think understand that, as Young said, Black people and Black editors can hold multiple Englishes on our tongues and do the work. If your first thought upon hearing a colleague or a potential colleague use Black English is to discredit them, pull back from that knee-jerk reaction and focus on the work, or on mentoring around the work. Their spoken language and their job skills are two things that aren't necessarily related. And this thinking, or shift in thinking, has implications for hiring interns and full-time staff. It influences who we see potential in. And further on the visibility piece, the question of whether Black English is a legitimate language with its own grammar, etc., is a closed issue among linguists. And editors love to quote linguists, right? So I feel like we should get on the bandwagon with this issue also. And going back to Young's piece, his thinking about dominant language ideology really struck me. And he got me thinking about the phrase language evolves, and how it might not be as progressive as we think it is. I mean, it still implies that there's one way, and with enough nudging and, advocacy, will allow certain words in and certain phrases. We could open ourselves further to the realities of our colleagues, authors, and readers. And that is a reality in which multiple Englishes are somersaulting over each other in each sentence. And though I welcome a world where non-standard Englishes have some place in writing, outside of writing about non-standard Englishes or outside of fiction, I realize that won't be the first action of this language revolution. But if nothing else, learning about non-standard Englishes can help how we edit. That is, look, for example, if we know that Nigerian English carries certain terms of phrase, when we're editing an author from Nigeria, we can better query if we think that their readers won't understand the turn of phrase, and our query will make more sense. Or if we know that Indigenous writers sometimes tend to use a nonlinear style, we won't throw out a dismissive query like tighten up this section, but we'll collaborate with them to refine the text and keep their authenticity at the same time. Ultimately, this issue connects with what we value as a profession. Do we want to show that concentrating on minor misspellings and errors in punctuation, or sharing our pet peeves on LinkedIn is really all editors care about and contribute? Do we want to further invest in hierarchies of languages and think of our work context as a war of us who are knowledgeable versus them who just don't get it, and we don't understand how they just don't get it? Or do we want to approach what we don't know, or what may seem flat out wrong to us, with more curiosity that leads to more communication and more learning about those Englishes? It could be refreshing, like finally accepting that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa. So there's this quote from June Jordan from her essay collection, Technical Difficulties. And it says, some of us have looked into the future and we have seen that the future will not be white or spoken or written in standard English. And I add this quote not to disparage white colleagues, but to bring home what Jordan calls our domestic multi-hinged realities and an accurate reflection of the global village just outside our borders, our national borders. Reporting on US Census data, The Guardian noted that non-Hispanic white people will be in the minority in the US by 2045. And the term global majority is growing in use to reflect that indigenous, African, Asian, and Latin American people and the diasporas connected to them represent 85% of the global population. The world is browner than we think, and our country is getting browner. That includes our audience, our writers, and hopefully our profession. So this exploration is a chance for me and other people of color to also think about who we want to be in that future. The jobs we have now weren't available or widely available to our parents and grandparents. But as more of us seek and get these jobs, who do we want to be at work? This question is particularly interesting when you're not the only Black person at work. Maybe it's two of you, and you're both playing a game of code switching. When do you turn it on, and when do you turn it off? It can be awkward knowing that the two of you know what you're doing, but your white colleague may have no idea. And do we want to keep doing this when there are like 10 of us or 20 of us in the room? And for every one of us who is in the middle of our careers and has largely made peace with quote unquote the way things are, there is a 20-something person of color just out of college who is entering a primarily white workplace and wondering where they fit in and how they can be seen as professional without performing whiteness. Now, for white colleagues, it's also a time to consider new things and consider how we want to be at work, namely taking the following actions. You don't need to appropriate the non-standard English to show you get it. And you don't need to make a big deal of not reacting when colleagues use non-standard English. You can let it be normal because it is to some people. You can also encourage and uplift younger colleagues who are people of color to prevent them from having feelings of self-consciousness. I'm sure nobody in the workplace uses 100% standard English all the time, which is Young's point that we're all always code meshing. And I see these actions as more of a spirit of the law issue than a letter of the law issue. The letter of the law would be to hire, promote, etc. And of course we should do those things. The spirit of the law is not saying, all right, girlfriend, to the only Black colleague when you don't speak like that in real life. The spirit of the law is to accept that your colleagues who are people of color may have words, cultural references, accents, and registers that are different from what you're used to, and that you can be curious about these instead of considering them wrong or shunning them or disparaging them. The work you'll do in these situations is work that your POC colleagues are doing every day. So I think it's only proper that we spread this work out a little bit. And in my last slide, I'm just sharing some terms and the titles of the works that I talked about, just in case you're also on your journey or beginning a journey exploring non-standard English also. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate everybody who showed up today. I hope maybe you have some questions that can help my thinking. Or comments. Also, you can also email me at info@outsidethebook.com. That's also at the bottom of every slide, and you'll get the slides as PDF also to download from the conference. But that's it, including those who speak another dialect, right? Yeah. Example, someone who speaks Indian English, yeah, might have difficulty with period. Yeah, and he talks a lot about knowing the author. Like, I think, we all think, oh, we're all just like jumping into this mainstream, right? Like, and everybody's got to act accordingly. But, everybody has context. The editor has a context they're coming from. The author has a context that they're coming from. So yeah, it's, and in these days of editing, we just don't have in some contexts, we don't have a lot of time to have those conversations, which is another maybe talk that I'll give about the dehumanization of editorial work, because they just kind of leave us like 5 hours to do whatever we're supposed to do, and that's not nice at all. Exactly. Yes. Mhm. Yes. 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 Okay, that could easily turn into my therapy session, but yep. I yes. Yeah. Oh god, let me see. Yeah, yes. And the unprofessional demeanor, Shannon, is like that it's right, like I'm saying, it's not just the words, right? It's the performing whiteness. Like when I'm around my family, I do not talk like this. I talk like car becomes caw. Like I talk totally differently. But it's not just like what I'm saying, but the register I'm saying it in. Like I'm not like, smiling all the time or whatever, but it's this quote unquote professional ideal that okay, like you got to be some kind of way in the workplace, and a lot of the times for black people that's performing whiteness to make white people more comfortable with how we're presenting ourselves. Oh, yep. Yep. Yes. Having to live in your customer service voice and like your customer service demeanor, right? Like, how can I help you? Like you always have to be like non-threatening. Um, yeah, let me see. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if it's just Barlow, Barcelo makes a good point. If accessibility and readability is a goal for academic articles, it would make sense to allow non-standard Englishes, which can be more readable and accessible to many people. It's true. It in a lot of ways with editing, communication is not the goal. Like the punitive things are like did you use curly quotation marks and is this M dash or N dash or it's like is that really affecting the communication of the piece? But it's these things that we do, right? And because our brains work a certain way, we're like, ooh, hyphen, it should be index because we like that kind of stuff. But everybody else doesn't like that kind of stuff. Everybody doesn't care. Uh, let's see. Oh, wait. Marnie, it says, are you talking to someone? It's not hearing. Oh, Marnie's not hearing something. Oh, God. Sorry, Marnie. Oh, wait. I see Marnie is piped up again, so maybe she got it. Oh, Shannon. Yeah, like you did the work. And yeah, Shannon says what made it worse was that I turned in exactly what they asked and I got in trouble because it wasn't what they wanted or meant. Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. She said I told you this wouldn't work. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. The microaggressions. Mm. Okay, let me see. Marnie's saying, I used to not ever speak with the author before editing. COVID and the prevalence of Zoom changed that for me. I definitely believe that changing my practice to almost always meet with the author before beginning the editing has made me a much better editor. And by better editor, I mean that I do a better job supporting the author tell their story in their voice. I like that. I work in corporate communications, and I wish I had the time to do that because we might get something from a communications manager that might be written by an author who's from Thailand, and it would be helpful to know like the author's context before we start working on the piece, because sometimes we come across expressions and I mean sometimes you have a knee-jerk reaction when you could just Google it and it'll tell you like that's a turn of phrase from Thailand, right? um but yeah, we just, never have that time or never have the ability to connect with the actual author because we're getting the piece from somebody else. Characters and customer service hair. Exactly. Yes. Oh boy. Let's see. I feel it's easier for people. This is Dana Redenor. I hope I'm saying your name right. Redenor. Um, I feel it's easier for people with attraction privilege to unmask. As a super fat person, I'm always conscious of how people perceive things like double chin. So what makes So that makes coaching calls somewhat nerve-wracking. And that too, yes. There's so many things that go into how people perceive us, right? Like just not listening to the content of what we're saying. It's like we got to go through all of this first. And like I said, so much of this is a chicken and egg thing, right? Like where do we start? And I know editors can feel like that too. Like we're just the damn editors. Like we don't we don't make the rules. But in some ways we do make the rules, right? Like there's a reason why you know, a lot of places don't say illegal immigrants anymore. Like a lot, some people do. Some people still, but that term is going out of vogue, right? It's because a lot of that work was writers and editors pushing for that change, so we can affect change. I think there's just more reading and stuff that we need to do besides the Chicago Manual and all these things that, are kind of like thrown to us to say like this is the way and this is what we do.
How do we know if it's working? Oh, and go back to the room. Thank you. Okay. Walking here. How's that? Okay. So, yeah, I don't really have a question, but more of a comment or maybe an analogy. I don't work in academic editing, thank goodness, for many of the reasons you mentioned. But so I mostly edit fiction, where, anything goes kind of. So that's, I appreciate the flexibility there. I work on a lot of what might be considered experimental fiction novels, and anyway, that's not what my that's not what my analogy is. Though I'm also a cookbook editor, and there's I feel like this is a little bit analogous to academic editing, even though they're wildly different. In that there's sort of like a voice for recipe styles, um, and I found myself in the position of editing a soul food cookbook by a Black author, and I was just like, I'm wildly unqualified to evaluate the the um, the dialects, I guess we'll say. But I also was grateful that I was the person doing it because I am flexible. I was like, I'm going to leave this. I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm not going to override unless it's something that you know um, reader is just going to wildly misunderstand, I guess, in terms of what the recipe is supposed to do. And I've talked with other cookbook editors, and I get the sense that they're more like prescriptive in their style, and they are like, if you say, trying to think of an example. I can't think of one off the top of my head on the spot right now, but there's like just certain wording. If you've looked at cookbooks, you probably see really consistent like beat the eggs at high speed for this long, and it just becomes a little flat, I guess. Anyway, what is my point? My point is just that it was really an illuminating experience for me to work on that book. I really loved working with that author, and I hope I didn't overstep, but I guess it was just the analogy of like there's a standard voice in cookbook editing, and I I now try to deviate from that as much as I can, like just to retain author voice. And I'm fortunate that I work with publishers where I create the style sheet completely, so I can just write in some of those guidelines so that the proofreaders don't override things that are just fine the way they are. Okay, that was my super long comment. Thank you.
Yeah, it's when all of these things are showing up in different contexts, right? Like, what would be the audience for, that person's cookbook? Maybe it's an audience that understands those terms. And like I said, I mean, these things are more, you know, more multicultural than we, imagine. I'm from New Orleans, and I think if I went to, Kansas or something, somebody might not recognize like the some of the words that I'm using, but white people from New Orleans know what I'm saying because, we kind of all talk the same way for the most part. Um, but I was going to say something about the indigenous style guide. Something that you said made me think about that. Um, but there's this ebb and flow too, because I know some of the people from the Indigenous Editor Society, and Greg Youngin himself says that in the book, that sometimes you can just say, oh, I'm not the editor for this, maybe you should try X, Y, and Z author who has more of a background with that. But two, oh, that's what I was going to say, that if there was some resources that you could go to, right, to say, what's this turn of phrase, what's this turn of phrase, and it's there's so much mainstreaming. I was just looking at um the Chicago Manual and the bibliography, where they list all of these, books that you can go to for more information or whatever. They don't say anything about the Oxford, Dictionary of African American, the Oxford African American Dictionary. They don't talk about that, but they do talk about like the British English Dictionary and this and that and this. But it's like they're all Englishes. Like, why are we just looking at these two? Are why are we disparaging some and being open to others? Like, there's a reason that people who are going to ACEs, the ACEs conference in April are looking forward to going to the medieval English session or whatever. And it's like, why? Any English besides brown people's English is okay. Like, any dialect is okay. And it's like, why are we not investigating the other ones? Because they're just as fun. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Sometimes I get tired. It's too much.
I genuinely hope that we end up in a place where more people can accept that, like, for example, my husband and I, um, there you go, I should spotlight myself so other people can hear me. My husband comes from Detroit. I'm from New Hampshire. We're both white, but when we first got together, we had so many communication issues because we would just talk past each other in local idioms.
Yeah.
And it took us years to understand how the other person was communicating. And I think if we, as editors and human beings, open ourselves to the idea that somebody else might not actually be using the same language we are, despite using the same language we are, it
Mhm.
would improve things and allow us to grow and learn versus trying to make everybody conform to the same little box.
Yeah.
Because making everyone conform to the same box is not helpful.
Right. And I just it's probably better to start with just the way we talk around each other and in the office. I mean, because just like, Kathy, I think, was talking about the example, it's the written English part is probably the next step or another step, but just accepting it the way it comes out of our mouths when we're talking to each other as colleagues, I think, is the first, step. Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I know. I mean, when I see that with the policing, I'm like, who hurt you? And I know who hurt you. It's your grammar teacher. That's who hurt you. And so you feel like you have to do that in other, contexts. And you don't have to do that in other contexts. Or when I see, like, because I do it myself when I'm policing myself, like if I type something and I'm like, Bert, I'll get back to you later. And then I have to quickly type, but I'll get back to you later. And it's like, okay, they know what you meant. Like, why are you doing that? Mm. Are we able to capture the chat? Because I'm missing stuff. I'm missing stuff. Oh, no,
Like
it's
aloud, if that's
fine.
helpful. The
Yeah.
this the chat is getting screen capped.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Alexis has said, have you found that some small, maybe POC-run publishing companies are more
Yeah.
freely publishing in a variety of dialects? I can find them myself, so this is more of a general question. It would help
Mm.
me as an editor to read more from those dialects, especially when there's been editing for clarity that doesn't override the dialect.
Yeah, and I think too, like right, like you're saying, like more exposure is kind of like gets your ear in tune with different people's Englishes. And I'm not aware of any publishers who like specifically like that's their thing. But the more I'm reading, I'm coming across things like this paper that I read that was entirely in Pidgin. I mean, it was from a couple of years ago, but the guy was talking about this press in Hawaii that's what they publish. They publish like local people, local books so that people, can write in their own style. But yeah, I don't know any off the bat though.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kath Kirk says, I was an ESL teacher in international schools for 10 years before I started editing, and that acknowledgement of other Englishes is a big part of it, especially when you have teachers with different linguistic backgrounds. Some people argued it would confuse the kids, but actually becoming aware of the amazing variety of ways to express yourself in whatever English you use. It's like Dorothy's first steps into Technicolor.
Oh, I love that. Oh my God. So that like does that like play into your how you approach editing too? That's awesome. I mean, I would love to have that background so that I could just be more aware of things. Like, we're always just talking about like you don't know what you don't know, and it's so frustrating. So yeah. Oh wow.
Sonia asked, maybe we can take a lead from poetry, which is more accepting of many different languages and dialects.
I like that. I
Um,
like that a lot.
Marnie asked, so if we are in a position to be more inclusive of multiple Englishes, what does copy editing look like? I'm going to mention this should be one of the last questions because it is 12. The
Mhm.
conversation can happen and continue. I encourage the conversation to continue, but the session is technically over.
Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think, that looks like, well, what the authors in that paper were trying to do was like just edit if things were not clear. So, how sometimes you might have an ESL writer who's like they're talking through a concept as they're writing, um, and the copy editor was trying to say, well, he gave two examples and was like, well, do you mean this, that kind of thing? Um, but you know, I think that, a lot of times we edit things because we're like, oh, this would be a tighter way to say that. And it's like, let the people say that. Like, I don't know if that's, I mean, when we're talking about corporate branding and all that stuff, that's like a different beast. But if we're talking about somebody like writing their thoughts, if that's how they want to come across, I mean, it'd be different if they said, well, kind of give me your feedback on what you think good writing is. And then maybe you can say, well, being more concise here or whatever, that's what I think. But if they don't think that and they think people understand them, then maybe that's the way. I don't know. I'm not saying that that is the way. I'm saying that, it's a possibility. I think maybe we're too hands-on sometimes with our or heavy-handed with our edits sometimes. Okay. So yeah, we're done. So if we want to continue, but E is going and maybe I'm going to.